The sun was dipping low behind the Texas hills, spreading long orange shadows over the endless sea of golden grass. The wind carried the dry scent of dust and wild sage, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote cried into the coming dusk. It was another hard day ending at the Malone Ranch, 2,000 acres of stubborn land owned by one of the most feared men in Carson County, Hank Malone, the giant rancher. They called him giant not only for his height, though he stood a solid 6'6" and built like a wall of oak, but for his presence, the kind that silenced rooms and made men lower their eyes. He was a man forged by sun and soil, by loss and labor. His mother had died birthing his sister, his father had died in a stampede when Hank was 17, and by 20, he was running the ranch alone. He didn't trust people. He didn't need to. The cattle obeyed, the workers feared him, and that was enough. At least, that's what he believed until she arrived. Her name was Clara Benson, a widow from Abilene. She came to Carson County one late spring morning, her dusty bonnet pulled low over her eyes, a faded blue dress hanging loose around her small frame. The train station master said she'd been looking for work since her husband's death, and that she'd heard the Malone Ranch was hiring help for the season. Hank didn't remember hiring widows. He hired men, strong hands, quiet mouths. But when she appeared at his door, soft-spoken yet steady, he found himself hesitating for the first time in years. "I can cook, sew, and keep ledgers," she said. "And I don't complain." Her voice was calm, but her eyes, the color of storm clouds over the plains, carried something deeper. It wasn't pity she sought, nor sympathy. It was purpose. That, perhaps, was what caught him off guard. Most people came to Hank Malone looking for money. She came looking for a chance to belong. He crossed his arms. "You ever worked a ranch before, Mrs. Benson?" "Not one like this," she admitted, "but I can learn fast." He studied her, the worn gloves, the dirt at the hem of her dress, the lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and silent grief. Hank wasn't a man given to charity, but there was something in her quiet resolve that stirred a flicker of respect. Against his better judgment, he nodded. "Fine. You can start in the kitchen. Mrs. Ellery'll show you around. Pay comes on Saturdays." She thanked him softly and walked toward the house, her small figure disappearing into the golden light. Hank watched her go, scowling at himself. "Ain't my business to rescue lost souls," he muttered, and turned back to his horses. Days passed. Clara proved to be more capable than he expected. She was early to rise, late to rest, and never complained, not even when the other ranch hands made careless remarks about the boss's little charity case. She mended clothes, cooked hearty meals, and even helped with the accounts when Mrs. Ellery's arthritis flared up. And though she spoke little, her presence brought a strange calm to the ranch, like rain after a long drought. Hank tried to ignore it. He buried himself in work, branding, trading, managing the men, but somehow, his eyes found her when she passed by with a basket of laundry or a tray of food. Once, he caught her humming an old lullaby while hanging clothes under the evening sun. He didn't recognize the tune, but it made something tighten in his chest. Then came the evening that changed everything. It was the night of the cattle roundup, and the men had returned dusty and tired. Clara had stayed up to prepare stew and cornbread for them. After the meal, as the men drifted off, Hank sat alone on the porch, the glow of his cigar tip flickering in the dark. Clara came out quietly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Long day?" she asked. He nodded. "Always is." She hesitated, then said softly, "You run this place well, Mr. Malone. Must be a heavy burden." He glanced at her, surprised. Few dared to speak to him like that, not with gentleness. "Been doin' it all my life," he said. "Ain't much to it once you stop expectin' anything good from folks." She smiled faintly, though sadness lingered in her eyes. "That sounds like a lonely way to live." The words hit him harder than he expected. He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable under her steady gaze. "Lonely's better than bein' disappointed." "Maybe," she said quietly. "But it's still lonely." There was a silence between them, soft, awkward, almost fragile. Hank didn't like it. He didn't like the way her words made his chest feel hollow. So he did what he always did when something scared him, he struck out. He leaned back, forced a smirk, and said, "You talk like you know much about disappointment, widow. You ain't worth marryin', but you sure talk like you been married twice." The words came out colder than he meant. Clara froze, her eyes widening just a little, not with anger, but with hurt. Then she looked away, her lips trembling, though she forced herself to stay composed. "I see," she whispered. "Good night, Mr. Malone." And she turned and walked back inside, her steps slow but steady. Hank sat there, the echo of his own cruelty hanging in the air. He told himself it was nothing, just words. She was too soft for this life anyway. Still, when the door closed behind her, he felt the night grow heavier. The stars seemed sharper, the wind colder. He tried to shake it off, muttering curses under his breath, but the truth gnawed at him. Because for the first time in a long while, he cared whether someone liked him or not. He didn't sleep much that night. Through the window of his room, he saw the kitchen light still burning long after midnight. And though he'd never admit it, he knew she was there, perhaps sitting by the fire, holding her grief close, just as he held his regrets. In the silence of the Texas night, the giant rancher realized that his words had done more damage than he ever intended. But pride was a cruel master. So come morning, he went about his day as if nothing had happened, though every time he passed her in the hall, she smiled politely, and that quiet distance between them stung more than any argument ever could. The Texas sky stretched white and merciless, painted in shades of fire as the sun sank behind the red hills. Dust hung in the air like memory, thick, dry, and unwilling to settle. On the edge of that horizon stood the Malone Ranch, a kingdom of cattle and grit, ruled by a man whose reputation reached farther than his fences. Hank Malone, known across Carson County as the Giant Rancher, was a man carved out of stone and sweat. He was 6'6", shoulders like barn doors, and eyes that could silence a man mid-lie. His word was law on that land, and no one questioned him, not the workers, not the traders, not even the sheriff. Hank didn't smile much, didn't trust anyone, and surely didn't believe in kindness. He had buried too many people to remember what it felt like to need someone. Then one spring morning, Clara Benson walked into his life. The train from Abilene screeched into Carson Station, throwing a gust of warm wind and dust across the wooden platform. Out stepped a woman in a faded blue dress, holding a single leather satchel and a worn letter of recommendation. Her bonnet hid most of her face, but her posture spoke of someone who had lost much and still stood tall. Clara Benson, 28, a widow for nearly a year. Her husband, Daniel, had died in a mining accident, leaving her with debts and no family. The letter in her hand led her here, to the Malone Ranch, where work, and perhaps a sliver of peace, waited. When she arrived at the ranch gate, Hank was out in the yard, breaking a wild mare. His shirt was soaked in sweat, his jaw locked with focus. She watched him for a moment, the way the horse kicked, the way he held his ground, refusing to yield. There was power in him, but also loneliness, like a man who'd built walls too high to climb. "Mr. Malone," she called, her voice soft but clear. He stopped, wiping sweat from his brow. His gaze fell on her, this fragile figure standing against the glare of the sun. "You lost, ma'am. I'm looking for work. Mrs. Ellery said you might be hiring for the kitchen." He frowned. "I hire ranch hands, not housemaids. I can cook, clean, mend, and keep accounts," she said quickly. "I don't expect favors, only fair pay." Her tone was steady, respectful but not pleading. Hank studied her a moment longer, his jaw tight. He wasn't used to being looked in the eye, especially not by a woman who carried herself with such quiet strength. Finally, he nodded toward the porch. "See Mrs. Ellery inside. She'll put you to work." "Thank you, Mr. Malone." As she turned to go, the sunlight caught her face, and for a brief second, he saw her eyes, gray like a storm rolling over open plains. Something stirred in him then, something unfamiliar and unwelcome. He turned back to his horse, grumbling under his breath, "Ain't no place for widows here." Days turned into weeks. Clara worked harder than anyone expected. She was the first awake and the last to rest. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the ringing of the bell before dawn, the sound of hooves pounding across the dirt, the laughter of men who didn't know what to do with kindness when they saw it. She never complained, never raised her voice. She just belonged quietly. Even the roughest ranch hands, who'd first mocked her, began to treat her with respect. She mended their torn shirts, made extra biscuits when rations were short, and listened when they talked about home. It was as if she carried a piece of peace with her, a peace Hank Malone couldn't understand. But Hank noticed her, more than he wanted to. Sometimes, from the barn door, he'd watch her hang laundry under the open sky, her hair coming loose in the wind. Sometimes he'd catch the sound of her humming, a low, sad tune that lingered even after she was gone. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet, he'd find himself thinking about her, about that calm face and those eyes that seemed to see right through him. He didn't like that. One evening, after a long, punishing day of rounding up strays, Hank came back to the house just as a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked across the sky, and rain began to fall in angry sheets. Clara was in the kitchen, lighting a lamp, when he walked in. She looked up, startled, but smiled faintly. "You're drenched, Mr. Malone. Let me get you a towel." He grunted, pulling off his gloves. "Don't need one. Just wanted to check the accounts." "You work too much," she said gently, setting a cup of coffee on the table. "A man can't fight storms forever." He gave her a long look. "Don't tell me how to live, widow. Storms are all I've ever known." Her eyes softened. "Then maybe it's time you stop fighting them and start letting them pass." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy, fragile. Hank felt something shift inside him, something that made him uneasy. To mask it, he let out a short, humorless laugh. "You talk like you know men, widow." "I knew one," she said softly. "And he was kind, even when life wasn't." That struck a nerve. Hank's voice turned sharp. "Well, he ain't here now, is he? Kindness don't keep a roof over your head or a ranch running." Clara looked down at her hands, the hurt flashing briefly across her face. "No, it doesn't. But cruelty doesn't either." The words hung between them. Hank's pride burned. He stepped closer, his shadow towering over her. "You think I'm cruel?" he said quietly, dangerously. She met his gaze, not with fear, but calm defiance. "I think you're lonely." That was too much. Something snapped in him, not anger, but shame disguised as it. His mouth twisted into a cold grin. "You ain't worth marryin', widow," he muttered. "Best remember that before you start preachin' at me." The words cut deeper than any knife. Clara froze, her breath catching. Then, with quiet dignity, she set down the cup she'd been holding. "Good night, Mr. Malone," she whispered. And she walked out, the soft echo of her footsteps lost in the thunder outside. The moment she was gone, Hank's chest felt hollow. He told himself it didn't matter. She was just a hired hand, no reason for guilt. But that night, as the storm raged outside and the wind howled through the empty halls, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, those calm gray eyes clouded with hurt, that trembling lip as she walked away. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The land smelled of wet earth and regret. Hank went out to the stables to distract himself, but even the horses seemed restless. He told himself he didn't care, yet when he passed the kitchen later that morning and saw Clara quietly sweeping the floor as if nothing had happened, he felt something twist inside him. He'd said those words to push her away. But instead, they'd pushed him into a silence he didn't know how to escape. And deep down, though he'd never admit it, Hank Malone, the giant rancher of Carson County, had begun to fear the one thing he'd always sworn he didn't need. A heart.